Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak at the college seminar series. I'll be talking about Acausal modeling and simulation of floating offshore wind turbines. My name is Tuhin. I'm an associate professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering. And I'll start with my research interests and teaching interests. My research areas are in dynamics control, modeling and simulation with applications in fuel cells, wind energy, power plants, grids, aerodynamics, energy efficient flight and robotics. And my teaching is also in similar areas, dynamics, controls, and vibrations. I've given some more information on this slide, but in the interest of time, I would like to proceed with the general approach of my research and teaching. My research is in system dynamics, which is a field that extends to almost all branches of engineering. And we do, systems engineering is an important part of the research that we do, where modeling and simulation is a critical element. We typically look at large-scale systems that are inherently multiphysics, meaning that these are systems that operate through a synergistic combination of thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, rigid and flexible body mechanics, aerodynamics, and so on. And especially this is true for modern energy systems like fuel cells, power plants, wind turbines, and so on. The way we approach these large-scale systems is through dynamic modeling, and the challenge lies in capturing these dynamic phenomena with sufficient accuracy, but still maintain the simulation speed. So we try to build these models, and they help us in understanding the steady state and transient characteristics. And this helps us in improving the performance of these systems through controls, for example. My teaching also reflects some of the approaches that I take in my research. We, in controls and in dynamics and control, we do take a holistic approach, and we give a system level perspective in different problems that we solve in the classes that I teach. So proceeding to the more specific topic of floating offshore wind turbines, I'll talk a little bit about the innovations and objectives. On the right, you see the logo of the Atlantis program. Is a picture, and superimposed on that is the is one version of our model that we are building. This project is under the Atlantis program of ARPA-E, and the main focus of this is, in our project, is to build causality-free model. Causality-free models are those where you simply specify the governing equations without actually mentioning or actually specifying in the model which phenomena leads to what. By giving the governing equations, the solver itself finds out what is the causality at a certain point of time, because indeed in these multi-physics systems, the causalities can switch from one causal effect to another causal effect. The causality-free modeling approach also helps us to build a very modular libraries and with component models, and these models are validated against experimental data. And the component models look very similar in terms of the layout to the physical layout in the energy system that is of concern. It also helps us to do structural innovations, because changes in the models, changes in the designs are very easy to do. And ultimately, it helps us to do control co-design, which essentially means that we want to develop the system and the control together so that at the end, we get an optimal system which is amenable to control. So with that, let's look at some specifics. Here is on the top left, you see our Acausal model of a wind turbine with the tower in the shown vertically through a column, and then the nacelle, and the nacelle is connected to a hub and blades. You can see the connection between the tower and the nacelle are bidirectional. There are no arrows here, basically showing that energy can flow in either directions, depending on the causality at any instant. You can see, for example, in the hub and blades, it is connected to the housing of the nacelle, but yet it is transmitting the rotational energy through the nacelle to the generator. So if we take a look inside the hub and blades, we see at the hub inertia, we see it is connected through a revolute joint to the nacelle. We see the actual blades that are that are installed at 120 degrees apart. So you get a sense that the hardware layout is kind of mimicked here. And this is one of the advantages of the Acausal model. And again, you see that a lot of the information that is flowing through is bidirectional because you don't see arrows over here. If you proceed into each of these blades where the aerodynamics become important or where the aerodynamics are modeled, and remember that these components are actually there. What we are showing are icons. Inside there are models, and the physics, governing physics, are modeled into them. If you look at the individual blade, you see the blade elements. Inside the blade elements, you have the aerodynamics being calculated. So here on the right, you see the blade elements. So here you have a combination of discretized model versus lumped parameter model. Whenever we feel that the discretization is important to capture the physics more accurately, we have to do that. In other cases where we feel that the model can be simplified by taking lumped parameter, we will use lumped parameter models. So for example, the inertia of the hub is a lumped parameter. So we have spatially resolved aerodynamics and also lumped parameter models working together. So without going into too much details of the modeling, I would like to show you some of the results. The highlights of these results is that we have collaborators at the University of Maine that are working with the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they have a pretty good experimental setup, and they do provide us experimental data and test cases. And what we have done is, as we have built this model over the last 1.5 years, it has now reached a state of maturity that we can compare our results with the results from experiments and also with the results of an industry standard software called OpenFast that is created by NREL. This software has been made over the last decade or more than a decade. Here is one test case. This is a steady state test case where the wind turbine is running at 12.83, or rather the wind speed is 12.83 meters per second and the blade pitch is 10 degrees. Another test case shown over here where the wind speed is much higher, wind turbine operating in the second regime, or regime 3 actually, and the blade pitch is also high. And the experimental results are in black, our UCF results are in blue, and the OpenFast results are in red. And you can see the pretty good correlation between the three, the experiments, OpenFast, and our model. So our model has reached a pretty good state of maturity within the last 1.5 years. Here is the wind turbine characteristics. Any wind turbine is primarily characterized through the CP lambda and CT lambda curves, CP being the coefficient of power, CT being the coefficient of thrust. You see the coefficient of power curves over here at different blade pitch values, and we see good correlation also, although there is some variation at higher lambda values, which are the tip speed ratios, but directionally, we see a good directional correlation in the directional dependence. This is the CT coefficient of thrust versus lambda curves. Again, we see a pretty good relation or pretty good agreement between the UCF data and NREL data. NREL data are the ones which have crosses with them. UCF are the simple lines without the crosses. Proceeding, we are not satisfied with only the steady state data. We also want to do validation, and in fact, validation when the wind turbine is being controlled in a closed loop manner. And so we have done that as well. The experimental setup has been run under different wind conditions. Here it is varying from less than 10 meters per second to more than 20 meters per second. And we see the pitch angle changes, we see the thrust, we see the rotor torques, and we see the generator speeds evolving. Again, the black lines are the experimental results. OpenFast is red and UCF is blue. And we see a very good correlation in our model versus industry standard OpenFast and the experimental data. This is another data that I would like to show here. The wind speed is more aggressive in the sense that it is sinusoidally varying. And again, we see very good agreement. All of these things are giving us, have given us quite a bit of confidence in proceeding forward with further development of our model. And we have recently filed software disclosure through UCF. And we are trying to explore options for either software commercialization or potentially just licensing it for research. So this is something that we have discussed with ARPA-E, and we have full support from them. Here is another closed loop control case where we have developed our own nonlinear controller, and we have shown that our own nonlinear controller works pretty well with the industry standard control, which is the Roscoe controller, again built by NREL. And here again, we do comparison with experimental data. And this is something that we are happy about because our nonlinear controller is arguably simpler than the Roscoe controller that is an industry standard. Proceeding forward, we are of course working on the floating offshore wind turbines. And so there is a large part of the wind turbine underwater, the submerged portion. And so here we have looked at two different kinds of submerged structures, the spar on the upper right and the tension leg platforms on the lower right. And we have modeled both of them. NREL is going to use the lower right. And so our modeling efforts will be focused on that going forward. We have done both time domain analysis, as you can see in the plots here, as well as frequency domain analysis. In the frequency domain analysis, we have started our validation with OpenFast, but not yet with experiments because the experiments are not yet ready. So in these hydrodynamics models and the hydrostatics models, we have looked at, for example, Morrison equation. We have looked at where we look at added mass and damping effects and some radiative effects from the hydrodynamics. Near and long-term goals. Well, one of the things I mentioned is that we are trying to do a software disclosure. And so we hope that in a year or year and a half, we will reach a point where this software can be licensed. And we are going to now turn our attention more into control methodologies. One of them is individual pitch control, where we change the pitch of the individual blades separately to get better control. We want to also do mooring line control, where the mooring lines can be actuated and the overall orientation of the wind turbine can be maintained under rough seas and extreme wind conditions. And we plan to go to multivariable control, where there are going to be different multi-input and multi-output controls that we are going to look into going forward in the next months and years. And finally, I would end with an acknowledgement of the support we are getting from ARPA-E on this Atlantis program, and we would also like to thank NREL for their collaborative support. Of course, I would thank my postdoctoral scholar and graduate students that are involved in this for their tireless work on this project. Thank you so much for your time, and that's it.